ever really stop to think about the rules we live by? Like, what if we could hit reset on the whole system?
Yeah.
What would our Constitution look like if we were starting from scratch today?
It's a pretty wild thought,
It really is.
especially given how much has changed since the 1700s.
Right? Like, think about it. The world back then is practically unrecognizable compared to now.
Exactly.
So that's what we're diving into today, this whole idea of reimagining the U.S. Constitution for the 21st century.
Oh, cool.
And we've got some seriously interesting material to work with.
Okay.
3 different blueprints, actually, 3 very different visions.
3.
Yeah, so back in 2020, a group of scholars got together, and they weren't just messing around. These are serious legal minds.
Yeah.
Conservatives, progressives, libertarians. Each team drafted their own version of a brand new constitution.
Wow. So we're not talking about just one hypothetical scenario, but 3 completely distinct approaches.
Exactly, and that's what makes this so fascinating.
Yeah.
We're going to be comparing these 3 modern constitutions side by side, looking at where they clash,
Right.
but also where they surprisingly agree.
Interesting.
So think of this as your crash course on how American governance could look in the future according to these different perspectives.
Okay.
We're going to be talking about things like limiting presidential power, the scope of individual rights in the digital age, all sorts of really fundamental stuff.
I'm intrigued already.
Okay, so first off, one thing that jumps out right away, none of these teams went for a total demolition job.
Interesting.
They weren't like, let's just scrap the whole thing and start over.
Right.
They all focused on reforming the existing Constitution, updating it for modern times.
So there's a shared recognition that there's still value in that original framework.
Exactly. It's more about building upon what's already there than completely reinventing the wheel.
Yeah, like a renovation project instead of a new build.
Exactly. Now, each team approached this renovation with their own distinct philosophy.
Makes sense.
So the conservatives really leaned into that classic Madisonian idea.
Oh, you mean James Madison, one of the founding fathers?
Exactly. They were all about those checks and balances, making sure no one branch of government becomes too powerful.
Yeah, preventing tyranny of the majority, that kind of thing.
Right. So they focused a lot on those structural mechanisms to protect liberty and equality.
Okay, so it's about designing the system itself in a way that safeguards those principles.
Exactly. Now, the progressives, unsurprisingly, put a big emphasis on embedding those principles of liberty and equality directly into the Constitution itself.
Got it. So they're looking to really solidify those values within the core text of the document.
Exactly. And then you have the libertarians.
Right.
They're all about maximizing individual liberty, often by limiting the power of the federal government.
Okay, so a more hands-off approach from the government.
Exactly. Less interference in people's lives.
Interesting.
Okay, so here's where it gets really fascinating. One of the most surprising areas of agreement across all 3 of these hypothetical constitutions is a shared desire to limit presidential power.
Wow. That's unexpected. I would have thought there'd be some major disagreements on that.
You'd think so, right? But they all seem to agree that the presidency has become too powerful.
Huh. Interesting.
And they get pretty specific about how to actually achieve this.
Oh, yeah.
For example, all 3 teams propose beefing up congressional oversight of the executive branch.
So basically giving Congress more power to keep tabs on the president and their administration.
Exactly. Making it easier for them to investigate how government programs are being run and to hold the executive accountable for any wrongdoing.
Okay, so it's about restoring that balance of power between the branches of government.
Precisely, and maybe even more significantly, both the conservative and progressive teams want to bring back a tool called the legislative veto.
Oh, I remember reading about that. Didn't the Supreme Court get rid of that back in the 80s?
They did in 1983, to be exact. But it's interesting that both of these teams want to resurrect it.
Yeah, what was it exactly?
So basically, the legislative veto would allow Congress to reject presidential regulations and executive orders without needing to pass a whole new law and get the president's signature.
That's pretty powerful.
It is. It gives Congress a much more direct way to control what the president is doing.
So if you're someone who's worried about presidents having too much power, this is something to pay attention to.
Exactly. It shows that there's a real appetite for reining in the executive branch, even among thinkers who disagree on a lot of other things.
That's a big takeaway for sure.
Now, another area where there's some consensus, although with some interesting twists, is impeachment.
Oh boy, that's always a hot topic.
It is. But here's the thing. All 3 teams agree that the grounds for impeaching a president shouldn't be limited to just criminal behavior.
Okay, so you're saying even if a president doesn't technically break the law, they could still be removed from office.
Exactly, if their actions are deemed seriously harmful to the country or to the office of the presidency.
Interesting.
They're all about holding presidents to a higher standard.
Makes sense.
And there's also a general agreement on making the impeachment process itself a bit more streamlined. So they all propose lowering the threshold for impeachment in the House of Representatives to a simple majority vote.
Like for any other bill.
Exactly. And when it comes to conviction in the Senate, they all want to keep the 2/3 vote requirement.
Right.
But it's the details around this that get really interesting.
Like what?
Well, the progressives have this idea that a 3/5 vote in both the House and the Senate should be enough to remove a president, even for actions that are being directly prosecuted.
Oh, wow. So they're basically creating a separate path for removal that doesn't rely on a criminal conviction.
Exactly. It's like saying, even if you can't prove a crime in court, this level of misconduct is still enough to get you kicked out of office.
That's a pretty significant change.
It is. And on the conservative side, they have this proposal to require the Attorney General's approval for any impeachment effort that could be seen as purely partisan.
Ah, so like a safeguard against politically motivated impeachments.
Exactly. Trying to inject some objectivity into the process.
Interesting. So even though there's agreement on expanding the grounds for impeachment and maybe making the process a bit faster,
Right.
the specific mechanisms they propose really highlight their different concerns about how to make sure the system is both fair and effective.
Exactly. All right, let's move on to another biggie, federalism, that whole balancing act between the federal government and the states.
Okay.
And here's where we start to see some real divergence in their approaches.
Like how so?
Well, as you might expect, the libertarians want to put the biggest limits on federal power.
So they're the most in favor of states' rights.
Exactly. They really hark back to those original intentions of the Founding Fathers. You know, a much stronger emphasis on the autonomy of the states.
Right. Letting states make their own decisions on as many issues as possible.
Exactly. Now, the conservatives and progressives are a bit more in favor of keeping that balance of power.
Okay.
But even they want to see stricter limits on federal overreach compared to the current system.
So there's a sense that the federal government has maybe gotten a little too big for its britches?
Maybe so, but here's an interesting point of agreement. All three teams propose some kind of mechanism to make it harder for federal laws to just automatically override state laws.
Really?
Yeah, like maybe requiring a 2/3 vote of the states or some very specific language in the Constitution before a federal law can trump a state law.
Huh. So there's a shared concern about protecting states' rights to some degree.
It seems so, even though their reasons for doing so and how far they want to go might be different.
That's pretty fascinating.
Okay, let's shift gears and talk about the legislative branch. Specifically, the progressives have some pretty bold ideas for reforming the Senate.
Oh, yeah, I've heard some rumblings about that. What are they proposing?
Well, one big thing is they want to increase the size of the Senate to 50 members.
50. That's a lot more than the current 100.
It is, but here's the key. They also want to allocate senators based on a state's population.
So like more populous states get more senators?
Exactly. So imagine California with its huge population could end up with like 13 senators.
Wow, and a smaller state like Wyoming might still only have one.
Right. It would dramatically change how much influence different states have in the Senate.
Yeah, no kidding. That's a pretty radical change.
It is. And they also want to move to 6-year terms with staggered elections.
We mean?
So instead of every senator being up for re-election at the same time,
Right.
only half the Senate would be up for election every 3 years.
Okay, I see. So it's like spreading out the elections over time.
Exactly. They argue that this would reduce the constant pressure on senators to fundraise for their campaigns.
Interesting.
And it could lead to a more competitive political environment.
So let's focus on campaigning and more on actual governing.
Hopefully. So now let's turn our attention to the judicial branch and specifically the Supreme Court.
Okay.
Here, we see an interesting point of overlap between the conservatives and the progressives.
What is it?
They both want to introduce term limits for Supreme Court justices.
Term limits for the highest court in the land. That's a pretty big change.
It is. They both suggest 18-year terms.
Wow. So no more lifetime appointments.
Nope. The idea is that this would encourage more regular turnover on the court.
Right.
And potentially make the appointment process less politically charged.
Because there would be more predictable vacancies.
Exactly. Now, the conservatives also have some other interesting ideas for the judiciary.
Okay.
Things like having state legislatures appoint senators.
That's going way back, like before the 17th Amendment.
Exactly. And they also talk about encouraging officials to vote their conscience more.
So like putting principle over party loyalty.
Exactly. It's more of a general goal, but it reflects a desire for less partisan decision-making.
Interesting. And what about the libertarians? How do they approach the judicial branch?
Well, they're really focused on clearly defining the original meaning of the Constitution.
Okay.
And they want to significantly limit the Supreme Court's power.
Especially when it comes to regulating anything that only has a minor impact on interstate commerce.
Exactly. They want to leave more power in the hands of the states.
So less interference in the federal government.
That's the libertarian way. Now let's dive into the final and arguably the most complex and contentious area.
I'm guessing you're talking about individual rights.
You got the Bill of Rights stuff.
Okay, buckle up.
Right now, all three teams agree that protecting individual liberties is absolutely crucial.
Yeah, that's kind of a cornerstone of American democracy.
Exactly, and they all emphasize the need to update those protections for the digital age.
So, like, thinking about privacy in the context of the internet and all that data collection?
Precisely. The Fourth Amendment, which protects against unreasonable searches and seizures, needs a serious revamp in their view.
Yeah. Times have changed since they wrote that amendment.
No kidding. But as we get into the specifics of certain rights, that's where those ideological differences really come to the surface.
Like, for example?
We'll take freedom of speech and religion.
Okay.
The conservatives and libertarians want to see really strong protections for those freedoms.
Okay.
Often without allowing for exceptions based on things like causing offense or disrupting public order.
So they're taking a pretty absolutist stance on those rights.
Exactly. They're all about maximizing those freedoms, even if it leads to some discomfort or disagreement.
Interesting. Now, the progressives, while they also strongly support religious freedom,
right,
they often add a caveat that the free exercise of religion shouldn't infringe on the rights of others.
Or disrupt public order.
Exactly. And they're generally in favor of things like campaign finance regulation.
To try and make elections more fair.
Right. So there's a bit more of a balancing act in their view.
Exactly. Those core values are still there, but they see a need to consider those potential conflicts with other important societal interests.
That makes sense.
And then, of course, there's the always controversial issue of gun rights.
Oh boy, here we go.
Right? This is where we see the biggest divide between the three proposed constitutions.
Okay, lay it on me.
So the conservatives explicitly include a right to bear arms.
Okay.
Primarily for self-defense or for recreational purposes.
Right.
But they also acknowledge that there's room for some regulation of firearms.
At both the federal and state level.
Exactly. Now, the progressives, on the other hand, don't actually recognize an individual right to bear arms in their draft constitution.
Wow. That's a pretty stark difference.
It is. Their focus is much more on gun control and preventing gun violence.
Okay, so public safety takes priority in their view.
Exactly. And then the libertarians, as you might expect, take the most extreme stance.
Let me guess. No gun control whatsoever.
Pretty much they say there should be zero infringement on the right to keep and bear arms.
So a complete freedom to own and use guns.
Exactly. It's a really clear example of how these different ideologies clash when it comes to balancing individual liberty with collective safety.
That's a tough one for sure.
But here's something important to keep in mind.
Okay.
As legal scholar Sanford Levinson pointed out, the most striking thing about all three of these teams isn't necessarily all the new rights they propose, but rather their shared focus on reforming the underlying structure of American government.
So it's less about creating a whole bunch of new rights and more about tweaking the system itself.
Exactly as Levinson put it. Why start entirely from scratch when we can build upon the underlying genius of James Madison's original framework?
That's a good point. There's clearly a lot of wisdom in that original design.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So as we wrap up, let's do a quick recap of those key takeaways.
Sounds good.
First, we saw a surprising amount of agreement on limiting presidential power.
Right.
And a shared interest in reforming the impeachment process.
Even though they had different ideas about how to do it.
Exactly. Now, when it came to federalism and individual rights, those ideological differences really came to the forefront.
No surprise there.
But overall, the emphasis seemed to be on refining the existing Constitution.
Updating it for the 21st century.
Exactly, not throwing the baby out with the bathwater.
Makes sense.
So for you, dear listener,
yes,
we'd love for you to think about what parts of these proposed changes resonate with you the most.
Right, like what principles do you think should be absolutely essential in our governing document today?
And if you're really curious, we encourage you to dig deeper into the full proposals from each team.
You can find all the details online. It's really fascinating stuff.
It's a great way to think critically about the very foundations of American democracy.
And to understand those ongoing debates about the U.S. Constitution and its future.
Exactly, because remember, these aren't just static documents.
Right.
They're constantly being interpreted, debated, reevaluated as our society changes.
As living, breathing things.
Exactly. And understanding these different perspectives can help us all be more informed, engaged citizens.
Absolutely. Food for thought, for sure.
You got it.
Thanks for the deep dive.
My pleasure.
This was great.
Always fun chatting with you.
Likewise.
Until next time.
See ya.